Hello everyone, this is Ashley Tucker from My Favorite Things. For today's card, I'm going to be using an older stamp set, but it is one of my favorite stamp sets. This is the Magical Friends stamp set. This set has a bunch of images of dragons, including this one of the dragon sitting with a little girl reading a book. And I love this image. I've used it several times before, and I decided to use it for today's card using a coloring technique that I haven't tried before. I also do want to mention, if I sound a little bit funnier than usual today, I am getting over a cold right now. There's just something going around and I got it, so my voice might be a little bit off today. But as usual, whenever I am sick, I have my tea next to me. I always like to have a hot cup of tea when I'm not feeling well. It usually helps. All right, so I started this out by stamping it with a Copic friendly black ink onto Nina Classic Crest Silver White cardstock. And like I mentioned before, I'm going to be coloring this in a new way today, at least new for me. It's a coloring technique I've seen other people do before, but I've never tried it and I wanted to give it a try. So you can see at the top of the paper where I tested out lots of different colors and combinations before starting, because I wanted to have a really solid plan since I had never done this before. So for this coloring technique, the main thing that you're going to do is you're going to fill in an area with just one color with your Copic marker, and then all of the shading is done on top of that with colored pencils. So if you were watching before when I was using the Copic markers, I wasn't doing any blending. I used just one marker color for each of the areas of the coloring, and I filled that area in completely with just that color. And then I grabbed my colored pencils after I had all of the Copic coloring done, and I went over the top of the Copic coloring with colored pencils to add deeper shading to the image. Now, as for the colors that I used, all of the Copic marker caps were on the screen, and the colored pencils that I'm using are Prismacolor pencils, and the different colors that I chose to use are dark green, olive green, lime peel, ginger root, 50% French gray, light peach, dark brown, dark purple, magenta, and pink. After finishing the coloring, I was really happy with the way that it turned out. Like I said, this is my first time doing this technique, and I wasn't expecting it to be perfect. I was expecting it to be a learning experience, and I expect that I will know what I'm doing a little bit more next time. But overall, I was really pleased with the way that it turned out. I think it's a really good idea to step out of your comfort zone sometimes and try new things, because that's the way that we discover things that we like doing that we would never have found before. Once the coloring was finished, I noticed that my black lines from the stamping were a little bit more dull than I wanted them to be, and that's because I used colored pencils, and when you use colored pencils over those lines, they tend to just get a little bit more dull. So I have the stamp in the same exact spot in my MISTI. I never moved it, and I'm just stamping over the top of that using VersaFine Onyx Black ink, and that makes my lines so much more crisp. Now that VersaFine ink is a pigment ink, so you're not going to want to touch it for a while it's drying. So set it aside, and now I'm going to work on the background. I'm making a shaker today, so this is going to be the background for my shaker. I have a piece of Canson watercolor paper taped down to a board with some painter's tape, and I'm using a watercolor brush to very loosely add some color to this. I'm using my Gonzai Tombi watercolors, and I just picked up some yellow, some orange, some reddish pink, and a plum purple color, and I added all of those, and now I'm just moving the board around and letting gravity kind of move that water around. I let that fully dry, and then I sprinkled some clean water droplets onto that, let it sit for quite a while, and then soaked them up with a paper towel. And of course, that does lift up some of that color. And then I'm actually going to take a few different colors of watercolor, and I'm going to just sprinkle directly onto this with the colors. And the first color that I use there is that plum purple. And then I went for some gold watercolor. And then the last one I'm using is the pearlescent white watercolor. And of course, I just get the paintbrush really saturated with the color. I use a small paintbrush, and then I tap the paintbrush over the top of the watercolor paper to get the splatters. I set the background aside to dry, and I'm moving on to creating another background. This time, this is going to be the front of my shaker. I grabbed a plum piece of cardstock, and I prepped it with a powder tool for embossing. And I embossed on that my favorite things background stamp, which is the Thick and Thin Lines background stamp. And I stamped that with Versamark ink to emboss, and then embossed it in a clear embossing powder. I cut this panel down to 5 by 3 3/4 inches, and then I used a basic oval die to cut a hole out of the center. If you don't have any oval dies, you could of course just use a circle die. And I'm going to turn that into my shaker window by adding some acetate to the back of it, and I glued that acetate on just using my tape runner. I picked out some different sequins that I thought looked good with this background, and then I added some foam tape to the back of my shaker window. And I did that by first doubling up the foam tape by folding it in half, and then I cut very thin strips of that foam tape. And then I'm going to take the backing paper off of both sides of the strip and very carefully wrap it around the border of my oval, making sure to fill in any gaps so that there's no space for the shaker bits to fall out. I also made sure to add some foam tape to all of the corners of this panel, and then I popped it up over the top of my watercolor piece, making sure that the area that is showing in the window is exactly what I want to be showing in the window, because the painting is a little bit larger than this background. And then I trimmed all of the edges that are hanging over the sides very carefully with some scissors. For my card base that I'm going to mount the shaker on, I really wanted a dark purple cardstock, but I didn't own anything that was close to what I was looking for. So instead of settling for a different color, I decided to make what I was looking for. I took a piece of the plum colored cardstock that I made the shaker with, and I colored the edges of it with a dark purple Copic marker. And then I adhered that onto an A2 size card base, and then I glued the shaker right onto that, and that worked out perfectly. I used foam tape to pop up the colored in image on the lower portion of my shaker window, and then I needed to make a sentiment. I chose a sentiment from the Magical Friends stamp set, and I stamped it with VersaFine Onyx Black ink onto some white cardstock, and then I die cut that sentiment out using one of my stitched sentiment dies, and then I popped it up, making sure that it is very straight at the top of that oval using a T-square ruler. And then to finish up this card, I'm just going to add some highlights using a white gel pen. And that finishes up today's card, and here's a closer look at the finished card, and you can see all of the shaker bits moving around inside. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you really enjoyed this card design and that it gave you some ideas and inspiration for your own projects. I hope you have a wonderful day today, and I'll see you next time.